Pass the gravy down to Uncle Robert, would you, Melissa? My stepmother Patricia's voice carried that particular tone she used when she wanted to remind everyone that I was useful for serving mothers. I reached across the mahogany dining table, careful not to disturb the elaborate centerpiece she'd spent 3 hours arranging this morning, and handed the crystal gravy boat to my father's younger brother. Sunday dinner at the Thornfield family estate had been a tradition for 32 years. Ever since my father inherited the sprawling Victorian mansion from his parents. Even after his death 8 months ago, Patricia insisted on maintaining the ritual. 23 family members gathered every week in the formal dining room, seated according to a hierarchy that had never been officially discussed, but everyone understood. I sat in the middle of the long table, between my teenage cousin Marcus and great-aunt Helen, who always smelled like lavender and disappointment. My half-sister Clarissa occupied the chair to Patricia's right, the position of honor that came with being the biological daughter. She'd held that seat since she was old enough to sit up straight, her golden hair catching the light from the chandelier like some sort of Renaissance painting. "So, Melissa," my Uncle Robert said, cutting into his prime rib with surgical precision, "Patricia tells us you're still working at that little law firm downtown. Have you considered something more substantial?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I'd heard variations of it every Sunday for the past 15 years, ever since I graduated law school and chose to work at a small firm specializing in family law and estate planning rather than joining the corporate practice that handled the Thornfield family's business interests. "Henderson and Associates suits me perfectly," I replied, taking a measured sip of wine. "We handle complex estate work. Quite fascinating, actually." Clarissa snorted delicately, a sound she'd perfected in finishing school. "Estate work? You mean helping old people write their wills? That's hardly practicing law." "Oh, it's more involved than that," I said evenly. "Trust administration, probate litigation, tax planning. You'd be surprised how complicated family wealth can become when proper documentation isn't in place." Patricia set down her fork with a soft clink. "Speaking of family wealth, I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room." The conversation at the table gradually died as her words registered. Uncle Robert paused mid-chew. Cousin Michael stopped scrolling through his phone. Even great-aunt Helen looked up from her dinner roll. "What elephant would that be?" I asked, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. Clarissa straightened in her chair, and I caught the look that passed between her and Patricia. They planned this. The realization hit me like a physical blow, though I kept my expression neutral. 28 years of family dinners had taught me to hide my reactions. "The will," Patricia said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when discussing household staff schedules. "Your father's will. We've all been tiptoeing around it for months, but it's time to be practical." "I wasn't aware there was anything to discuss," I said carefully. "Dad's will was quite clear. The estate was divided equally between Clarissa and myself, with smaller bequests too." "That's exactly the problem," Clarissa interrupted, her cheeks flushing the way they always did when she was about to say something she knew would cause damage. "The will treats us as equals, but we're not equals, are we?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could feel everyone's attention focusing on our end of the table like a laser beam. Uncle Robert had stopped eating entirely. Cousin Jennifer was staring openly, her mouth slightly agape. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, though I absolutely knew what she meant. I'd known this conversation was coming since the day after Dad's funeral, when Patricia had suggested we reassess the family structure now that the patriarch was gone. Clarissa took a deep breath, the kind she used to take before diving off the high board at the country club pool. Melissa is adopted. She's not actually Dad's daughter. She shouldn't inherit the same amount as me. The words hit the table like a grenade. Several people gasped audibly. Great Aunt Helen dropped her dinner roll. Cousin Marcus, who was 17 and normally glued to his phone, looked up with wide eyes. Clarissa, Uncle Robert said in a warning tone, but Patricia held up her hand. No, Robert. She's right to bring this up. We've all been thinking it. Patricia's gaze swept the table, and I watched as several family members nodded slightly. Harold was generous to a fault, but he wasn't thinking clearly in his final years. The family assets should stay with family. Blood family, Clarissa added, as if the distinction needed clarification. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching the faces around the table. These people had been at every birthday party, every graduation, every holiday for the past 28 years. I'd helped plan Uncle Robert's surprise 60th birthday party. I'd babysat Cousin Michael when he was in elementary school. I'd written the legal documents for Great Aunt Helen's trust fund. And now they were nodding in agreement as my legitimacy as a family member was dissected over Sunday roast. The adoption was finalized when Melissa was 3, Uncle Robert said slowly, though his voice lacked conviction. Harold considered her his daughter. Legal technicalities. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. The point is, she's not a Thornfield. Not really. The family money should stay with the family line. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Clarissa leaned forward eagerly. A revised distribution. You can keep the house in the city, and maybe one of the smaller investment accounts. But the estate, the business interests, the family trust, that should come to me. I'm going to have children someday. Real Thornfield children. The phrase real Thornfield children hung in the air like a slap. I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. And you all agree with this assessment? I asked, looking around the table. More nods. Murmurs of agreement. Cousin Jennifer cleared her throat. It does make sense, Melissa. I mean, we love you. But I'm not really family. I finished for her. Exactly. Clarissa's voice was bright with relief, as if we'd finally gotten past an awkward misunderstanding. You can still come to Sunday dinners, of course. Nothing has to change between us personally. I took another sip of wine, buying myself time to process what was happening. These people, my family for 28 years, had just voted me out of my inheritance while assuring me I could still serve them gravy on Sundays. Have you discussed this with the estate attorney? I asked. Patricia's smile tightened slightly. We thought we'd handle it as a family first. Work out the details amongst ourselves before involving lawyers. I see. I set down my wine glass with deliberate care. And when exactly did you all decide this? Was there a family meeting I wasn't invited to? Now don't be dramatic. Great Aunt Helen spoke up for the first time. We're just being practical. You're a lovely girl, dear, but you're not a Thornfield. The money should stay with blood. I nodded slowly, as if considering their position. Around the table, I could see the relief on their faces. They'd expected a fight, tears, perhaps threats of legal action. Instead, I was being reasonable, diplomatic, just like I always was. Well, I said finally, I can certainly understand your perspective. Clarissa beamed. I knew you'd be sensible about this. You always were the practical one. There's just one small problem with your plan, I continued, reaching into my purse. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. What sort of problem? I pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sealed with burgundy wax. Dad's personal seal, the one he'd used for important documents. Every person at the table recognized it immediately. Dad left me this, I said simply, setting the envelope on the table between the candlesticks, with instructions to open it if anyone ever questioned my place in the family. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its ticking. What is it? Clarissa's voice had lost its confident edge. A letter, I said. Would you like me to read it? Patricia's face had gone pale. Melissa, there's no need to. Oh, I think there is. I broke the wax seal with careful precision, unfolded the pages inside, and stood up. This is dated 3 days before Dad died, witnessed by his attorney and his doctor. My hands were steady as I began to read. Though my heart was pounding so hard, I was surprised. No one could hear it. To my beloved daughter, Melissa. I began. If you are reading this letter, it means someone in the family has questioned your right to inherit equally with Clarissa. I hoped this day would never come, but I know my wife and daughter well enough to prepare for it. Patricia made a small sound like air escaping from a balloon. I want you to know that from the moment you came into our lives, you were never anything less than my daughter. Not adopted daughter, not stepdaughter, my daughter, period. But there are things about your adoption that the family doesn't know, things I've kept private to protect you. I paused, looking around the table. Every face was frozen in anticipation. Melissa is not adopted from strangers, as everyone believes. She is my biological daughter, born from a relationship I had before I married Patricia. Her mother, Catherine Williams, was a remarkable woman who died in a car accident when Melissa was 2. I adopted my own daughter to give her legal protection and a stable family, not because she wasn't already mine. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, but I kept reading. The DNA test results are in my safe deposit box, witnessed and notarized. Melissa is a Thornfield by blood and by love. More than that, she is the child who chose to spend her life helping families navigate legal complexities, who dedicated herself to protecting people's rights, who understood the value of fairness and justice that I tried to instill in both my daughters. Clarissa had gone white as the tablecloth. Patricia was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. For this reason, and because I believe she will honor the family legacy better than anyone, I am leaving the majority of my estate to Melissa. The will filed with the court is not my final will. The real will is in my safe deposit box, along with the DNA results and documentation of Melissa's true parentage. She inherits the house, the business interests, and 80% of my liquid assets. Clarissa will receive 20%, which is more than generous considering her complete lack of interest in anything beyond her own comfort. I folded the letter carefully and looked around the table. The silence was deafening. There's more, I said quietly. Instructions for Patricia's widow's pension, which was contingent on her treating me with respect, and a provision that anyone who contests this will or attempts to exclude me from family functions will forfeit their inheritance entirely. Patricia finally found her voice. That's impossible. We saw the will. The lawyer read it. You saw the preliminary will, I corrected. Dad filed the real one 3 days later, after he realized what might happen. He'd been watching the family dynamics for months. He knew exactly how this conversation would go. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. How long have you known? Since the day he died. His attorney gave me the letter along with the keys to the safe deposit box. Dad wanted me to wait and see if the family would accept me as I was, or if I'd need to, clarify my position. Clarissa's face was a mottled red and white. You let us believe. You sat there while you revealed exactly who you are, I said gently. Yes, I did. The next few minutes were chaos. Patricia stood up so quickly, she knocked over her water glass. Clarissa started crying, not the delicate tears she used for sympathy, but ugly, desperate sobs. Uncle Robert was on his phone, presumably calling the family lawyer. Several cousins were talking at once, their voices rising in pitch and volume. I sat quietly through it all, the letter still in my hands. Great Aunt Helen, who had remained silent through the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. So you're actually Harold's daughter? His biological daughter? Yes, I said simply. She nodded slowly. And you're inheriting the estate? The majority of it, yes. And you could have told us this at any time over the past 8 months. I could have. Another nod. But you wanted to see what we do first. Dad wanted to see what you do first. Great Aunt Helen picked up her dinner roll and took a thoughtful bite. Smart man, Harold. Always was good at reading people. By the time the initial shock wore off, half the family had left. Uncle Robert and his wife hurried out after a terse conversation with their lawyer. Several cousins made awkward excuses and disappeared. Even the household staff seemed to sense the shift in dynamics. I noticed the way Patricia's personal assistant started avoiding eye contact with her. Patricia herself had locked herself in Dad's study, presumably going through his papers looking for some way to challenge the will. She'd find nothing, of course. Dad had been meticulous. Clarissa sat in her chair like a deflated balloon, mascara streaking down her cheeks. This isn't fair, she whispered. I'm his daughter too. Yes, you are, I agreed. And you'll inherit 20% of a very substantial estate. Most people would consider that life-changing money. But you get everything else. The house, the business, the trust fund. I get the responsibility, I corrected. Do you have any idea what's involved in managing a family trust? The tax implications of the business holdings? The maintenance costs on this house alone. She stared at me blankly. Dad knew what he was doing, I said. He left the money to the person who would protect it, grow it, and use it to take care of the family. That's what I've been training for my entire career, even if I didn't realize it. But you're not even really his daughter, she said weakly, then stopped as she realized what she'd said. Actually, I'm more his daughter than you are, I said without malice. Biologically and legally, but that's not why he chose me. Over the following weeks, the family dynamics shifted like tectonic plates. Patricia moved out of the main house and into the guest cottage. Her status changed from widow of the estate owner to dependent relative. She tried to contest the will, of course, but Dad's documentation was ironclad. The DNA test was conclusive, the witnesses were unimpeachable, and the new will had been filed properly. Clarissa went through what could only be described as an identity crisis. Without the promise of unlimited wealth to cushion her future, she was forced to confront the reality that she'd never developed any actual skills or interests. She eventually took a job at a local boutique, which was humbling for someone who'd never worked a day in her life. Some family members, Uncle Robert, a few of the cousins, made genuine efforts to rebuild their relationships with me. Others simply disappeared, unwilling to accept the new hierarchy. Great Aunt Helen, surprisingly, became one of my strongest allies. I always knew there was more to you than met the eye, she told me one Sunday over tea. You had Harold's patience and his strategic mind. The business interests that Dad had built over 40 years were complex and far-reaching. real estate developments, investment portfolios, charitable foundations, and a small but profitable technology company that he'd started as a side project in the 1990s. Understanding it all, managing it responsibly, required exactly the kind of legal and financial expertise I'd been developing for the past decade. 6 months after that devastating Sunday dinner, I hosted my first board meeting as the primary beneficiary of the Thornfield Trust. The conference room at Henderson and Associates had never seen anything quite like it. 12 board members, 3 attorneys, and 2 accountants, all discussing the strategic direction of a $50 million family estate. Patricia attended, as required by the trust documents, but her role was purely advisory. She sat at the far end of the table, her face a mask of controlled resentment. Clarissa didn't attend at all. She'd waived her board position in exchange for early access to her inheritance. The quarterly reports show strong performance across all sectors, the portfolio manager announced. The real estate holdings have appreciated 12% this year, and the technology investments are exceeding projections. I nodded, making notes on the detailed financial statements. What about the charitable foundation? Are we meeting our distribution requirements? More than meeting them, the foundation's director replied. The scholarship program has expanded to include 3 additional universities, and the family services grants are making a real impact in the community. These were the conversations Dad had prepared me for, I realized. All those dinners where he discussed business strategy while Clarissa played with her phone. All those weekends when he'd invited me to review investment reports while she went shopping. He'd been training his successor, and everyone had assumed it would be his biological son he never had. After the meeting, as the board members filed out discussing lunch plans and golf schedules, Patricia approached my desk. She looked older than her 58 years, as if the stress of the past months had aged her prematurely. I want you to know I'm not giving up, she said quietly. Harold was my husband. This estate should be mine. I looked up from the financial reports I was reviewing. Actually, under Illinois law, you're entitled to exactly what Dad left you: the widow's pension and the cottage. The rest was his to distribute as he saw fit. You manipulated him, she said, her voice low and bitter. Turned him against his own wife and daughter. I helped old people write their wills, remember? I said gently. Dad taught me that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about who shows up, who takes responsibility, who protects the people they love. She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. That evening, I sat in Dad's study, my study now, going through his personal papers. Hidden behind the legal documents and financial statements, I found a folder marked, "For Melissa." Inside were photographs from my childhood, report cards he'd saved, copies of awards I'd won in school. At the bottom was a note in his handwriting. I always knew you'd be the one to carry this forward. You have your mother's compassion and my stubborn streak. Take care of them all, even the ones who don't deserve it. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the folder. Outside the study windows, I could see the lights of the guest cottage where Patricia was probably planning her next legal challenge. Somewhere across town, Clarissa was working her shift at the boutique, learning for the first time what it meant to earn her own money. The family I'd grown up in was broken, perhaps irreparably. But the responsibility Dad had left me wasn't just about managing money. It was about rebuilding something better. The Sunday dinners continued, though the guest list was smaller now. The family trust continued to grow and support charitable causes. And slowly, carefully, I began reaching out to the family members who were willing to build new relationships based on respect rather than hierarchy. One Sunday evening, as I was closing up the study, I found Great Aunt Helen in the kitchen making tea. "You know," she said, handing me a cup, "your father would be proud. You handled all this with more grace than any of us deserved." "I had a good teacher," I replied. "Yes, you did. But you also had something Harold always hoped for, the wisdom to know when to be patient and when to act." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "That letter wasn't just about the inheritance, was it? It was about showing everyone who you really are." I smiled. Dad always said the truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. And now? I looked around the kitchen where I'd helped prepare countless Sunday dinners, where I'd learned that family was about more than shared DNA or legal documents. Now we build something new, something better. Great Aunt Helen nodded approvingly. Harold would like that. He always believed in second chances. Third chances, in some cases, I said, thinking of the family members who were slowly, cautiously, trying to rebuild bridges they'd burned. "Well," she said with a slight smile, "that's what family is for." As I turned off the lights and locked up the house that night, I thought about the conversation that had started it all. Clarissa's declaration that I didn't count, that I wasn't really family, that I shouldn't inherit equally. She'd been wrong about almost everything, but in one sense, she'd been right. I wasn't the same person who'd sat quietly at that dinner table 8 months ago. I was Harold Thornfield's daughter, his chosen successor, and the guardian of his legacy. But more than that, I was someone who'd learned that true family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who's willing to share your burdens, your hopes, and your Sunday dinners, even when the conversation gets difficult. The letter had given me an inheritance, but the confrontation had given me something more valuable, the knowledge of who I really was and who I wanted to become.